Welcome to this week's deep dive video. Today we have Austin Presko with us, and he is the associate minister at Parkview Christian Church. He is the man of many hats, as the associate minister. I'm sure you find yourself doing different things every day, whatever needs done.
Yeah, all kinds of different things. I spend 6 hours a week setting up tables and chairs to grocery shopping, to lesson planning, to communion preparation, all those fun different stuff.
That's the joy that comes with being the associate. It's wherever there's a need, you get to go meet it. That's exciting. Austin and I met in Missouri working with Gasconade Christian Service Camp, volunteering our time out there and taking our youth out there for ministry. And it's been a joy knowing him and getting to study scripture and serve alongside him. So I'm very glad to have him this week. Good. That would be awkward if you said, actually, I'm upset to be here. So Austin's been looking at Acts chapter 2 with us this week. And Austin, what stood out to you in this passage? What is it you'd like us to look at?
My favorite part, because Acts chapter 2 is the Pentecost. And my favorite part is while they're sitting here doing it and they're just starting to hear everything, it starts to talk about language and how they're communicating with each other and how they're so excited. These guys were already together, so they could communicate somewhat to start with. But just the basis of all of this language where they all started coming together and seeing and everything, they wouldn't just hear things. In our world, we have ideograms and things that we say that are unique to the places we are, where, if you're from the South, you say y'all. And, you hear stuff like that and you're like, oh, I know where this person's from.
Yeah.
But if you're from the South, you don't even hear that word. You just hear the meaning. These guys were hearing each other so closely. They were hearing it in their own terms and in their own thing. So it was speaking directly to them. And that is awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. There's something about like wherever you go, missing a piece of home. And like my wife, Katie, she picks up accents unlike anyone I've ever met. She's like a accent chameleon. We had a group come in when we were working for YouthWorks from Minnesota. And after 2 days, Katie had a thick Minnesotan accent and they loved it. She just blended right in with them. And there's something about that, like finding the familiar when you're not around it. And the passage here talks about in verse 5, now there were dwelling in Jerusalem devout men from every nation under heaven, and this idea of missing some of those cultural things, like you mentioned, some of the idioms, being able to hear not only in a language you understood, but being able to appreciate it and ingest something that felt like home, Rome was good at unifying with power and oppression, but not so much with culture and community.
Yeah. It's just fun. We think about that too, because unified, when you're talking about that too, back to language, because I had another thought while you were talking. Sorry.
No, story of my life.
The language, well, we like to talk. It's what we do.
Yes.
Well, but when we're talking about that, our language nowadays is very standardized because of mass media, because of the communication that we have, because of all those things. If you go back a couple hundred years and you bring people from other sides of the country together, they have a much harder time communicating. Just like when you talk about people from Minnesota, you bring somebody from Minnesota and put them up with somebody from the Bronx 100 years ago, they're going to have a really hard time talking to each other. We take language and communication more for granted because of the abundance of a standardized communication that we hear. So words stay the same, the meanings stay the same, more or less. We change a lot of words regularly anyways, but our words stay closer together. Their words would have been very localized and localized a whole lot more than we think about now. Now we think about commuting and we're like, yeah, I drive 20 miles to work. That's no big deal. They were like, man, I've never been 20 miles from my house in my life. And I'm really, if you think about walking, 20 miles is a long ways to walk.
Yeah. Yeah, I can't remember the statistic, not the statistic, but the number off the top of my head. But Jesus' whole ministry was in a very small area, under 100 miles, that Jesus would have spent his whole life, with the exception of his time in Egypt, being in. It's just a crazy thing to think. We can do that in an afternoon, and it's not a big deal. But for them, like you said, that would have been their whole life. Have you
Right.
seen the kids show Bluey?
Yes.
Okay. I love watching that with James, and it's Katie and I often trying to convince him that's the show we need to watch. It's so good. But I started listening.
Relatable.
It is. It's a very honest but also enjoyable show. And I've been listening to an Australian podcast, and there are terms I only know because we've watched Bluey and had to figure out what they were saying. It's still English, but it's Australian English, and there's just enough difference where you can miss the point. They'll laugh at something in this podcast, and I'm like, what was that? And I have to go Google why it was funny, which kills the joke. It's like, oh, okay, I guess that's why they laugh. But can you the living your life immersed in that, and then all of a sudden getting that refreshing, and now I'm hearing it in my own tongue, and now I don't have to have the work of figuring it out. At one point in my life, I could speak Spanish-ish, and it's a skill that's gone probably forever. But at one point, I could do it, and I remember hanging out with a couple of guys I worked with who that was their primary language, and I could figure out what was being said, and I could kind of participate in the conversation. But it made my head, like my brain, tired. It was so much work, and for them, it was effortless. And now we get to see that same thing here, but God didn't do it just for them to have unity and a sense of home. Peter goes right into the gospel. In fact, all of them were preaching the gospel. What's it say here? Both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabians, we hear them telling in our own tongues the mighty works of God. Like that, so cool. This unifying experience centered around this message that God had been preparing. Not just for a few days, but for thousands of years for this moment. So cool.
Right. And they got it explained exactly in the words they needed in exactly the way they did so they could understand it. And basically it was the first missionary training.
Yeah.
All of these guys are going through all of this and they're learning it all and knowing it as well as they physically can.
Yes. Yeah. And there's some debate. And I actually didn't know about this until last week. So forgive me. I'm introducing something I'm not well studied on. But there was an influx of people coming back to Jerusalem that had fled Rome in the past couple hundred years when Rome was taken over Palestine. And they had escaped and didn't want to be caught up, their families to be caught up. So now you have people for 2 or 3 generations raised other places, but now there's stability in the region. So they've been returning home, and you see some of this division in the area. And not only that, like you mentioned, it's Pentecost. There's this festival that brought in people from, it was part of their pilgrimage. A good Jewish person at this time, at least some point in their life, would come to Jerusalem for Pentecost, stay from Passover through Pentecost. And most people couldn't do that every year. It'd be cost prohibitive, but it was something everyone was trying to do. And the population would have just had this big boom at the time, people coming back and people coming for Pentecost, and all these cultural issues and all of these language barriers that all of a sudden overcome. And here they've come back for what was supposed to be home, but we know in AD 70, right? So everybody's pretty comfy and good and settling, but the Christians start to get persecuted pretty big in just a few chapters, and in time-wise, just a couple of years, Christians start to get persecuted pretty heavily in this area. But then AD 70, Rome is tired of all this garbage in the region, comes in swinging, destroys the temple, and everyone gets scattered again. So all these people who have been wrestling with here in the gospel, whether they loved it or hated it, get sent all over the world with, like you said, a perfect understanding of it. So,
or at least as perfect as we can as human beings.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. Yeah, I think there's always we are always part of the barrier in explaining it. Yeah. Yeah. It's but so cool. God's plan to bring a moment of unity and peace to a people who had been seeking it for generations and who were missing it in the moment. God used that need, or met that need, to serve his purpose. Pretty cool thing. I love it.
Mhm.
Cool. Well, Austin, do you have anything else for us, or do I am I letting you off the hook?
I mean, I just there's a whole lot of things there, but that's really the extent of like the excitement of that. And there's a whole lot of things that happen inside of there, but yeah, that's my favorite part of it. Whenever I read that chapter, I always concentrate on that because I'm a kind of a language nerd and I love going through the different things and to do all those things. And when you really dig into that, how much of a miracle that was. Also, it was one of his most widely witnessed, or the most widely witnessed miracles that happened total, because all of this stuff happened and there was a minimum of 3,000, because there were 3,000 that turned towards at that point, but minimum of 3,000 people that all saw this miracle happen
Yeah.
live.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know in my life, I've had times where I've thought, oh, God, like if only you could show me something supernatural that would solidify my faith, that would be it. But you look all the way back from the beginning. God's constantly working outside the rules for his creation, doing these miraculous things, and it satisfies people for a moment. We'd like to think that would be a lifetime worth, but it's just a moment. The people in Exodus, as they're leaving, he does signs and wonders all the time. And as soon as they get a little uncomfortable, they turn, and here they would rather view these disciples, these believers doing the impossible, as them being drunk than go, this is outside the norm. This is outside the laws of nature. Maybe this is God working. They chose to instead say, they're drunk, and go their own way.
Yeah.
People will hear what they want to hear and see what they want to see. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you, Austin, so much for being with us today and helping us take a closer look at Acts chapter 2.
Glad I could be there, guys.
We'll talk to you soon, Austin.
Thanks, guys.